What would you do if you found out the person you trusted most had been living a double life? A man, a wife, and a neighbor. 3 lives tangled in lies, deceit, and betrayal. But what happens when the truth finally comes crashing down in the most unexpected way? This is a story you won't believe until you see it for yourself. Stay with me, because the shocking twist at the end will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your thoughts. Do you think you'd ever forgive betrayal like this? Now, let's get into it. It was a quiet Sunday morning in the small suburban neighborhood where Catherine and Tom had lived for over 30 years. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow through the kitchen window. Catherine stood at the stove, the smell of bacon filling the air, but something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones, an unease that had been growing for weeks, something she couldn't quite explain. Tom, her husband of 35 years, was at the table, staring at his coffee, his mind clearly elsewhere. Catherine tried to shake off the feeling. It was a typical Sunday. They were having their usual brunch, just the two of them and their neighbor, Margaret, the widow who lived next door. Margaret had been a part of their lives for years, ever since her husband had passed away. Catherine considered her a friend, someone they shared meals with and swapped stories over the years. But today, as she set the eggs on the table, something felt different. The air between them was thick, almost suffocating. Margaret smiled politely as she picked at her food, but Catherine noticed how she seemed to linger just a little too long on Tom. Her eyes would occasionally meet his, and then quickly shift away when Catherine caught the exchange. It was subtle, but Catherine wasn't blind. She'd seen it before, those little moments, the ones that didn't seem to matter at the time, but added up when you looked back. Tom, too, was acting strange. He didn't laugh as loudly as usual, didn't tease her about her cooking like he always did. Instead, he kept looking at Margaret, shifting in his chair, avoiding Catherine's eyes. Catherine took a sip of her coffee, trying to remain calm, but her mind was racing. Her thoughts flashed to the night before when Tom had come home late from a business meeting, but there were no details to fill in the blanks. He'd brushed it off like it was nothing, but Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She watched him now, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping nervously. What was he hiding? "Tom," Catherine said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time with Margaret lately." Tom stiffened, his eyes flicking towards Margaret for a second, before quickly returning to his coffee. He didn't respond immediately, and Catherine knew right then that he'd heard the question before it was even asked. Margaret, sensing the change in the air, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "She's just been a good friend," Tom muttered, his voice quieter than usual. It was a strange response, and Catherine noticed how his gaze didn't meet hers. He was avoiding her eyes. That wasn't like him. "Just a friend," Catherine repeated, raising an eyebrow. She couldn't help it. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "You've been over there every evening this week, Tom. You didn't mention that before." Tom's face tightened. "It's nothing, Catherine. Really." He looked down at his coffee, avoiding the question entirely, but his voice was defensive, almost too defensive. Catherine said nothing. She picked up her fork and started eating, her mind racing. Something didn't add up. She had been married to Tom long enough to know when he was hiding something. There had been too many late nights, too many rushed conversations, too many times when he had gone out without giving her any real explanation. Margaret, always the quiet, kind widow, had never been a concern until now. Something was shifting, and Catherine could feel it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. As the conversation moved on to lighter topics, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching something unfold that she didn't want to see. Tom laughed a little too loudly at a comment Margaret made, and Catherine noticed how their eyes met again, lingering just a moment longer than they should have. It was like a silent understanding passing between them, something Catherine wasn't a part of, something she wasn't supposed to see. Her heart pounded in her chest. She kept telling herself she was imagining things, that she was being paranoid, but she couldn't ignore it. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces fit together. But what was she supposed to do? Confront Tom now in front of Margaret? Number not yet. Catherine wasn't the type to make rash decisions. She would wait. She had to. For the rest of brunch, Catherine forced herself to smile and laugh along with the conversation, but every part of her was focused on Tom and Margaret. She had a sinking feeling, one that told her this wasn't just a passing thought. Something was going on, and whatever it was about to change everything. But for now, she would wait. She had learned over the years that sometimes the truth came to you when you least expected it, and she had a feeling that today would be one of those days. The morning dragged on. After Margaret left, Tom was unusually quiet. Catherine couldn't quite place it, but his silence felt louder than words. He'd never been one to sulk, yet today he barely looked at her. The silence hung between them like a heavy cloud, and Catherine felt a growing tension in her chest. She went about her usual chores, folding laundry, organizing the kitchen, but her mind never stopped spinning. Her eyes kept drifting to Tom, who sat at the table, staring into space, lost in his thoughts. It wasn't like him to act this way. When Tom was troubled, he usually worked it out with words. He was the kind of man who spoke his mind for better or worse. But today he couldn't meet her gaze. Every time she looked at him, he seemed to avoid her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Something was wrong. Catherine didn't press him. She knew better than to ask too many questions right away. She was patient, perhaps too patient. But today she wasn't sure if she could wait much longer. She needed answers. At lunch, when Tom finally spoke, his voice was tight. "I'm going to take a walk," he muttered, pushing his chair back. "Clear my head." She nodded, trying to act casual, though her insides were twisting. She watched him grab his jacket and head out the door, the familiar sound of his footsteps in the hallway filling her ears. Catherine stood there for a moment, frozen in place, as if the space between them had grown too wide to cross. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Catherine moved swiftly to his coat, hanging on the peg by the door. She didn't even hesitate. Her fingers were shaking as she reached into the pockets, her mind racing with every second. There had to be something small, some little clue that would confirm what she already feared. Her hand brushed against something soft in his jacket pocket. She pulled it out, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a crumpled piece of paper. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. It was a note from Margaret. "Tom, I miss you. Can't wait to see you again tonight, same time as last week." The words hit her like a slap in the face. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just a friendly neighbor. This wasn't just a passing affection. This was an affair. Her fingers tightened around the note, and she felt a surge of rage. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, numb. The paper crinkled in her hand as the truth settled over her like a cold, heavy blanket. She folded the note carefully, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How long had this been going on? Was it only with Margaret? Or were there others? Catherine didn't want to think about that. She couldn't. Right now, all she could focus on was the fact that Tom had been lying to her face day after day, and she hadn't seen it. The guilt settled in next. Why hadn't she seen the signs sooner? Had she been so busy with her own life that she missed the little moments, the oddities that didn't make sense? Tom had been distant for weeks now, but she had excused it. Work stress, nothing to worry about. But now, the puzzle pieces were coming together in a way she couldn't ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Tom was back. She turned quickly, stuffing the note into her pocket before he could see it. Tom entered the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He looked at her, but his gaze was distant. He didn't seem to notice her sudden shift in demeanor, her quiet tension. "I'm going to go upstairs for a bit," he said, his voice still flat. Catherine nodded. She couldn't bring herself to speak. What could she say? How could she ask him, after everything, to explain himself? No, she wasn't ready for that yet, but she would be soon. As he walked up the stairs, Catherine felt a cold certainty settle in her gut. She had to confront him. But how? What would she say? Her mind raced with the possibilities, but none of them seemed right. She knew one thing for sure. The truth had already changed everything. The following days dragged by, each one feeling heavier than the last. Catherine tried to maintain some normalcy, though it was getting harder. Tom's behavior grew more erratic. He was withdrawn, barely speaking to her except for the occasional grunted response. And yet he kept up his routine, leaving for work, coming home late, always avoiding any deeper conversation. He acted like nothing had changed, but Catherine could feel it in every corner of the house. Margaret, too, kept her distance. She'd stop by to say hello, but would make quick excuses to leave, her eyes flickering nervously whenever Tom was around. Catherine noticed, and she couldn't help but wonder, how long had they been sneaking around behind her back? It didn't make sense to her. Margaret was supposed to be a friend, a widow who needed support, not someone who would betray her trust like this. She had known Margaret for years, and in a way that made it worse. Catherine kept the note hidden in her drawer, the crumpled paper a constant reminder of the lie Tom was living. It seemed like the more she waited, the more the walls closed in. The truth was suffocating her, but she couldn't bring herself to confront Tom. Not yet. She needed more. She needed something more concrete, something undeniable, because in her heart she still wasn't sure if she could believe it. Could Tom really betray her so deeply? The tension was unbearable. Every morning, every night, it gnawed at her. And all the while, Tom kept up his strange routine. He'd leave the house at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, and come back hours later, as if he hadn't been gone at all. Catherine's patience was wearing thin. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now they were screaming at her. It was on the 5th day after finding the note that Catherine decided she could wait no longer. She had to act. She couldn't let this go on any longer, not with her life and dignity on the line. Catherine had decided that the next time Tom was out of the house, she was going to search through his things, his phone, his computer, anything that could give her the full story. She was done with the guessing, done with the uncertainty. She needed proof, and she knew she wasn't going to find it by just watching him. That afternoon, Tom left for what seemed like another one of his impromptu errands. Catherine didn't waste a second. She quickly went to his study, the room where he always kept his laptop, his phone. She had never been one to snoop through his things before. But this wasn't about being nosy. This was about protecting herself. This was about the truth. Her heart pounded in her chest as she picked up his phone. She hesitated for just a moment, but then the temptation was too strong. She unlocked it with the passcode she had known for years. 1234, something he always thought was clever. She scrolled through his messages, and there it was. The first thing that caught her eye was the string of texts between him and Margaret. It wasn't just casual messages. No, it was something more intimate. Calls, late-night texts, reminders of things they had shared. But the worst part? The last text sent only an hour before he'd left the house that morning. I'm counting the minutes until I can be with you again. Just the two of us. Don't keep me waiting too long, love. Catherine's stomach dropped. She had known it, of course. But seeing it in black and white so plainly was different. This was not a misunderstanding or some harmless flirtation. This was an affair, and it had been going on for months. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, and she had to sit down. In the quiet of the study, Catherine's thoughts raced. Her mind tried to piece together the fragments of her life with Tom, but all she could hear now was that final text. Don't keep me waiting too long, love. Love. It felt like a slap in the face. Catherine had spent years loving this man, building a life with him. But now she was just another person in the way. He had found someone else, and worse, he had done it with someone she had trusted. The silence in the room was suffocating. She stared at the phone in her hands, wondering what she should do next. Should she confront him now? Should she wait for him to come home? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her own phone ringing. She froze. It was an unknown number. A feeling of dread washed over her. Hesitant, she answered. Catherine? The voice on the other end was soft, almost apologetic. It was Margaret. I don't know how to say this, Margaret said, her voice trembling. I never meant to hurt you, Catherine. I didn't want any of this. But I'm afraid Tom and I, we... Catherine's heart raced. This was it. Margaret was finally admitting the truth. She was finally coming clean. But as Margaret spoke, Catherine's anger flared. Every word she said felt like an insult. Margaret sounded so helpless, so sorry for herself, yet she had never considered the pain she was causing Catherine. I'm sorry, Margaret said again, her voice breaking. But I love him. I didn't want you to find out this way. Catherine's jaw tightened. Well, I did, she said coldly, and I'll deal with it. Don't worry about me. She ended the call before Margaret could say another word. Her hands were shaking now, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the fury that had built up inside her, the years of trust and loyalty shattered in an instant. She wasn't sure what she was going to do next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. As she looked down at Tom's phone, her mind began to work. The next move was hers, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Tom didn't return home until well after dinner. By then, Catherine had barely touched her meal. She wasn't hungry. Her stomach was a twisted knot of anger, confusion, and betrayal. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the uneaten food in front of her, listening to the sound of his footsteps as he entered the house. Hey, Catherine, Tom started, but his voice trailed off when he saw her sitting in the dim light. The tension in the room was thick, heavier than anything they had shared in years. Catherine didn't speak immediately. She just sat there, watching him, waiting for him to break the silence. He'd always been the first to fill it, but tonight he seemed lost for words. Finally, he closed the door behind him and took a cautious step forward. You all right? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I'm fine, she replied, her tone flat. But you're not. Tom froze, his eyes narrowing slightly. He looked as though he was trying to piece together what she meant, but Catherine wasn't going to make it easy for him. I found something today, Tom, she said slowly, her voice unwavering. A note, a message. Tom's face went pale. His eyes flickered with panic, but he didn't speak. The silence between them stretched, and Catherine saw the guilt in his eyes, the way he seemed to shrink under her gaze. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat a reminder of how far they had come from the life they had built together. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Catherine stood up then, walking slowly toward him, the note still burning in her pocket. Don't lie to me, Tom. I know what's going on. I know about you and Margaret. Tom swallowed hard, his face reddening. He opened his mouth again, but it was like the words stuck in his throat. "Catherine, I don't," she cut him off sharply. "You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to pretend like everything's fine. I know you've been lying to me. I know you've been sneaking around behind my back. You've been with her, haven't you? And now you're going to tell me you didn't mean it." He took a step back, his hands held up in surrender. "Catherine, please." But she wasn't done. "You've been leaving late at night, sneaking out like a thief. You've been texting her, meeting her. And for what? So you could get away from me. You think I wouldn't notice? You think I wouldn't feel it? Every damn day, Tom, I've been feeling it." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't care. The hurt had poured out of her now, like a dam breaking. She wasn't going to hold back anymore. "You think I haven't noticed how you've been avoiding me?" Catherine's voice was cold now. "How you can't even look me in the eye anymore?" Tom seemed to shrink further under her gaze. He didn't say anything at first, and then he mumbled, "I didn't mean for it to happen, Catherine. It just did. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" she interrupted, her voice rising with the question. "Why, Tom? Why go behind my back? Why do this to us?" He opened his mouth again, but no words came. His hands dropped limply at his sides, his head hanging. Catherine's anger shifted, twisting into something darker now. She didn't want to hear the excuses. She didn't need to hear them. What was the point of hearing apologies that would never make things right? She wasn't going to waste any more time. "I don't need your apologies, Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need the truth. I need to know how long this has been going on, how many times you've lied to me, how much you've let me believe in something that was a lie." Tom's eyes darted around the room, as though he was looking for an escape, but there was no way out. Not now. "I've known for days, you know," Catherine continued, her words sharp, "but I needed to hear it from you. I needed to hear you admit it." There was a long, painful silence as Tom opened his mouth again, but this time he spoke the words Catherine had been waiting for. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It's been going on for months. I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what happened." His words hit her like a slap. But Catherine didn't let the tears come. Not yet. She wasn't done. "I don't know what happened either, Tom," she said coldly, the finality of the words cutting through the air. "But I do know that what's happening right now is the end of us." Catherine didn't want to hear anything more from Tom, the man she had spent half her life with, the man who had promised to stand by her, had betrayed her in ways she couldn't even process. His apologies felt hollow, his words meaningless. But just as she turned to walk away, her phone rang. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Margaret. Catherine hesitated, her hand hovering over the screen. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let Margaret stew in whatever guilt she was carrying. But then something cold and sharp within her told her to answer it. She needed to hear this for herself. She needed to know the woman who had been the other half of Tom's betrayal, the woman who had stolen him from her. She answered the phone, her voice calm, but edged with the anger she'd kept bottled up for days. "Margaret." There was a brief pause before Margaret spoke. Her voice sounded cracked, as though she'd been crying. "Catherine, I need to explain. I'm done listening to your explanations." Catherine cut her off. "You and Tom, you've made your choices. There's nothing you can say that will change it." "I never meant to hurt you," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I never meant for this to happen. Stop," Catherine interrupted again. "I'm not interested in your excuses. You knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what was at stake. And still, you chose this. You chose him over me, and that's something you'll have to live with." Margaret's voice faltered. "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to happen like this. I never meant to hurt you, Catherine. I thought you would understand." "Understand?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "How could I ever understand something like this?" There was a long pause on the line. Margaret didn't respond, but Catherine could hear the shakiness in her breath, the guilt in every word. But Catherine didn't care anymore. She wasn't interested in any more apologies, any more regrets. "You've already done enough, Margaret," Catherine said coldly. "Now I'm going to do what I have to do." Before Margaret could say another word, Catherine hung up. She stood there for a moment, her hand still gripping the phone, her body tense with the weight of what had just transpired. But there was a sense of finality in the air now. This was the end. The truth had come out, and it was time for Catherine to decide what came next. Catherine didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Tom and Margaret flashed in her mind. The guilt in his eyes, the apologies that meant nothing, everything she had believed about their marriage, about him, was now shattered beyond repair. The house felt too big, too empty. It was supposed to be their home, a place where they shared everything, but now it was just a hollow shell filled with the ghosts of what used to be. By morning, the decision was clear. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't stay in a house where lies were the foundation and betrayal was the air they breathed. For all the years they'd spent together, Catherine knew she couldn't move forward without first taking control of her life. She was done being the one who had to fight for respect, for truth. Now she needed to fight for her own peace of mind. Tom was still in bed when Catherine made up her mind. She had no intention of dragging this out, no more pretending everything was fine. She would speak her truth, and whatever came after, she would handle it on her own terms. She walked to the bedroom and stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment. He looked peaceful, unaware of the storm that had already broken. It sickened her to see him like that, so unaware, so comfortable. He had no idea what he had lost. He had no idea how much of a fool he had made out of her. "Tom," Catherine said, her voice steady but firm. Tom stirred, blinking awake, but he didn't look at her immediately. It was as though he had gotten so used to avoiding her gaze that he didn't even realize how much of a habit it had become. "Tom," she said again, louder this time. He finally looked up at her, eyes still heavy with sleep, but his expression quickly shifted to something more guarded when he saw the look on her face. "I'm leaving," Catherine said flatly. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement. Tom's eyes widened slightly, and he pushed himself up on one elbow. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not going to do this anymore," Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the heavy emotion crashing over her. "I'm not going to stay in this house with this life, with a man who's been lying to me, deceiving me for months. I'm done." Tom's face went pale. "Catherine, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I can fix this. I'll end it with Margaret. Just give me another chance." Catherine didn't flinch. "You don't get to ask for a second chance, Tom. Not after what you've done." He sat up fully now, his face desperate. "I was confused. It was a mistake, Catherine. I love you. You know that, don't you?" "I thought I did," she replied, her voice colder than before. "But love doesn't work like this. You don't hurt the person you claim to love. You don't betray them. And that's exactly what you've done." There was a long silence between them. Tom looked like he wanted to say more, but Catherine didn't give him the chance. She had heard enough. "I'm taking my things and going," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You're not going to fix this. Not now. Not ever." Tom looked at her like she had slapped him. "Catherine, you can't just—" But she had already turned and walked out of the room, her decision final. There was no going back. Catherine left that morning just hours after making her decision. She didn't pack much, just a few clothes, her important papers, and a small suitcase. She didn't need anything more. It wasn't about possessions anymore. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her sense of self. She didn't know where she was going yet. Maybe she'd stay with her sister in the city. Maybe she'd rent a small apartment. What did it matter? Right now, all that mattered was getting away from the man who had broken her heart. She didn't need his apologies. She didn't need him at all. As she stepped out of the house and into the cool morning air, she felt a strange sense of freedom. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. She didn't know what was next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her life again. When she drove away, leaving the house behind, she didn't look back. She knew that whatever happened next, she would be okay. She would rebuild her life. She would figure it out. And for the first time in months, Catherine felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that house years ago. She was stronger now, wiser, and no longer willing to put up with betrayal, no longer willing to be a passive bystander in her own life. Tom could try to fix things with Margaret. He could chase after her if he wanted to. But Catherine knew that whatever he tried to do, it wouldn't change the fact that the damage was done. She was moving on, and that, in itself, was enough. As she drove further away from the house, Catherine couldn't help but wonder, what would Tom do now? Would he truly regret his actions, or would he continue on with his affair, too blind to see what he had lost? But it didn't matter. Not anymore. The answers to those questions were no longer hers to find. She had made her choice, and now she was free. 2 weeks had passed since Catherine left. She had settled into a small apartment in the city, a place she could call her own, a space where she didn't have to think about Tom, about Margaret, about the life she'd left behind. It was a fresh start, even if it was a difficult one. She spent her days filling the emptiness with new routines, new habits. Work kept her busy, and in her spare time she explored her own interests, things she'd neglected for years. Slowly, she began to heal, to remember what it felt like to exist for herself and not for anyone else. But just as she thought she was gaining some semblance of peace, the phone rang. She hadn't heard from Tom, not since the day she left. And that had been fine with her. She didn't want his apologies or explanations anymore. The truth had already come out, and that was all that mattered. But this call, she didn't expect it. "Catherine?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it at first. It was Margaret. Catherine felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she didn't let it show. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clipped, guarded. I need to talk to you," Margaret said, her voice tremulous. "Please, it's important." Catherine hesitated. What could Margaret possibly have to say? There was nothing left to discuss, but for reasons she couldn't quite understand, she found herself agreeing. "Fine. Talk," Catherine said, her patience thin. Margaret took a shaky breath. "I've made a mistake," she began. "A big one. Tom, he's not the man I thought he was. He's been lying to both of us. He's been lying to me too." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" "Catherine, listen to me. There's something you don't know. Tom, he's been seeing someone else, someone on top of me." Margaret's voice cracked, and Catherine felt a knot form in her stomach. "Don't tell me you're sorry," Catherine said coldly, the hurt from the last few weeks rushing back. "I don't want your apologies." Margaret's voice grew more urgent. "I'm not apologizing. I'm trying to warn you. You have to know what he's been doing. You have to understand that he wasn't just with me." Catherine's pulse quickened. "Who else?" she asked, the words tasting like acid in her mouth. "I don't know exactly," Margaret said, her voice raw. "But I found something he didn't expect me to find." Catherine felt her stomach drop. "What did you find?" Margaret was silent for a moment. A second phone, a second life. Catherine's world stopped. The words echoed in her mind. A second phone, a second life. She couldn't process it at first. What could Tom possibly be hiding? Hadn't he already done enough to destroy everything? But now the truth was about to take another dark turn. "What are you saying?" Catherine's voice trembled, despite her attempt to keep it steady. "What does this mean?" "I don't know all the details," Margaret said, her voice urgent now, "but I think he's been seeing someone else, someone you don't know about, someone he's been hiding from both of us." Catherine could feel the blood rushing to her head. It was like everything she thought she knew had been turned on its head. Tom had lied to her. He had betrayed her. But this was a new level. Another woman. How many secrets had he been keeping from her? "Why are you telling me this now?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. It wasn't because Margaret cared about her. It was because Margaret felt threatened now, as though she had been played just as badly as Catherine. "I couldn't let you go on thinking it was just me," Margaret said. "I was angry. I thought he was the one who had been using me, but I was wrong. I was just another one of his lies. I need you to know, Catherine. I need you to be ready for the truth." Catherine didn't say anything. The silence between them was unbearable. Finally, she whispered, "Where is he now?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Catherine could feel her hesitation. Then, in a quiet voice, Margaret said, "I think he's seeing her right now. I think he's with her as we speak." Catherine's chest tightened. She could hardly breathe. "I need to find out who she is," she said, her words harder now. "I'm going to find out everything." Margaret hesitated for a moment. "Be careful, Catherine. This man is dangerous. He doesn't just lie, he manipulates." Catherine's mind raced. She was done being a passive observer in her own life. She had learned the hard way that people like Tom didn't deserve her sympathy. She would take control. She wasn't going to let him slip through her fingers again. "I'm done letting him lie to me," Catherine said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm going to get the answers I deserve." The call ended. Catherine didn't waste another second. She had to find the truth. It was clear now that Tom had been leading a double life, and she wasn't going to sit around and let him get away with it. She wasn't sure how she was going to do it, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let this go unanswered. She spent the next few days piecing together the fragments of information Margaret had given her. Catherine had never thought she'd be the type to hunt down secrets. But now, it felt like the only way to regain control. She reached out to people she knew, connections she had, to see if they had seen Tom with anyone else, anything that could give her a lead. One evening, after a few days of tracking down leads, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "I know where he is." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure if she should trust it, unsure if it was a trap. But she had come this far. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to back down now. The message led her to a small cafe on the edge of town. It was quiet, out of the way, nothing that would draw attention. But Catherine didn't need attention. She just needed the truth. She parked her car down the street and walked to the cafe, her steps slow but determined. Inside, she spotted Tom almost immediately. He was sitting at a table in the corner with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was younger, her hair long and dark, and she was laughing at something Tom had said. There was an intimacy in the way they interacted, something Catherine could never unsee. Her blood boiled. Catherine didn't move right away. She watched from the doorway, feeling the cold rush of betrayal all over again. But this time it wasn't just Tom she was angry with. It was herself. She had allowed this man to make her feel small, to make her question her worth. She didn't wait for the confrontation. She stepped into the cafe, walking straight up to their table. Tom's face went pale when he saw her, his eyes wide with shock. The woman looked up, confused at first, and then recognition flickered in her eyes. Catherine's voice was quiet, but cold. "I think we need to talk, Tom." And just like that, everything they had built came crashing down.